Hi, I'm Jonah, and this is a Learn to Play tutorial for Love Me Tender. And this is a great song for almost any level of player. It's a pretty straightforward song to learn, which is great for beginning players or intermediate players that are wanting to learn some cross fingerings, but it's also great for advanced players that want to learn how to add their own flair into songs, how to put in grace notes or add flutters here and there. So the simplicity of the song actually aids in letting that creative side of us come out and adding those into it. Now I'm going to be playing this on a sparrowhawk in the key of A, but you can play this on any key, and the different keys are going to give different feels to the song. Like the deeper bass notes are going to have that kind of like slower, more emotional feel, kind of that Elvis Presley feel. And then the higher pitched notes are going to have a much more upbeat, lively feel to them. So depending on what flute you have and what mood you're in, you can experiment with different tones on this with this song. Now I'm going to play through the song once, and then I'll go through a brief introduction on how to use this tutorial, and then we'll move right into the tutorial itself. Now, the easiest way that I find to learn songs is to work through them phrase by phrase. Now, phrases are like sentences. You put a bunch of sentences together to build a story. In the same way, you put a bunch of phrases together to build a song. Essentially, each time you pause to take a breath, you've completed a phrase. And because in the music we've added these breath marks, you can easily see that the phrases begin and end at each of these breath marks. I've also noted the number of the phrases using these numbers with lines through them. Phrase 1, 2, and so on. As I walk through each phrase, I'll note anything that's unusual or particularly challenging in that phrase, and then I'll show you how to play it, and I'll play it at a really slow tempo. And at that point, I suggest pausing the video and working on that phrase until you have the fingerings and the rhythm pretty well down at that slow tempo, and then move on to the next phrase. Once you move through the whole song, I suggest going back to the beginning of the song and working through each phrase again. And each time you do that, your hands will memorize the fingerings a little bit more, and you'll memorize the rhythms a little bit more, and the song will get easier to play, and you can start bringing it up to tempo. These are the notes that some of you may not have played before, so when you come to these notes in the song, have some patience with yourself. It may take a little time to learn the transitions from the note before it to this note and to the note after it. I'll also talk more about these transitions and notes as we come upon them in each phrase. Now, this is the sheet music for Love Me Tender, and it's a pretty straightforward song, especially in the rhythm. It's composed mostly of quarter notes, and then there's some half notes and whole notes, but there's nothing too tricky in here. If you haven't worked with cross fingerings before, then there's going to be some challenges to work through with regards to this note here. And there's times when you're going to be cross fingering going into that note and times when you're going to be cross fingering going out of it. And even if you're not cross fingering, meaning opening and closing holes at the same time, even if you're just opening holes or closing holes, then it's still a pattern, fingering pattern that you may not be used to. So you might need to take a little time in the phrases when this note comes up, and it comes up quite a bit. So this is the first phrase, and within this phrase, coming off the first note into the second note, you go right into this note that might be new for a lot of you. And we're not cross-fingering going from this first note to the second note, but we are going from the second note to the third note And so because of the cross fingerings and because this note might be new for some of you, what I'd suggest is pausing the video and working really slowly through this first phrase and teach your fingers the sequence, especially this first 5 notes, going from the first note to the second note. Start really slowly and just go back and forth, back and forth. And as you do so, your fingers will learn the dexterity of that transition, and you'll be able to do it quicker and quicker. And then go from the second note to the third note and do the same thing, and then the third note to the fourth, and the fourth to the fifth. And then start moving through the whole sequence very slowly, and then start speeding that sequence up. It'll be really helpful because a lot of these same transitions are seen throughout the song. So it'd be helpful to pause here and get that dexterity down and then move on to the rest of the song as well, because you'll see these again and again. This is the second phrase, and again we have this note here that requires a cross fingering coming off of the last note in the first phrase and moving into this phrase to catch this note. And then again at the very end of this phrase right here, we have this cross fingering coming off this note and moving into this note. And again, like I mentioned earlier, these cross fingerings come up in almost every phrase. And so if you take the time to learn it within this first couple of phrases, you'll see these same cross fingerings in the rest of the phrases of this song. And so you'll have that dexterity down, and it'll be a lot quicker to learn those phrases. This is phrase 3, and it's an exact replica of phrase 1, so it should be straightforward at this point since you took some time and worked through the cross fingerings in phrase 1. And here's what it looks like. This is phrase 4, and phrase 4 is an exact replica of phrase 2. And actually, like I mentioned earlier, phrase 3 is a replica of phrase 1. So in this song, phrases 1 through 4 are the verse, phrases 5 through 8 are the chorus. Within the verse, you have a theme, which is phrase 1 and 2 put together, and that theme is repeated twice in 1 and 2, and then again 3, 4, and then you move into a chorus. And then as the song moves on, from at the end of the sheet music, you'd go back to the beginning because the verse and the chorus are repeated a number of times. And so that's a very common song structure in today's music, having a verse and a chorus that are repeated a number of times. This is phrase 5, and this is about as straightforward as phrases get. All the notes are the same. It's all quarter notes moving to a half note at the end. So the challenge of a phrase like this is to make it sound interesting. And so you can do that by using your breath pressure to create inflections. So maybe a little bit softer in the beginning, and as you get towards the middle of the phrase, you're putting a little more pressure in to make it just slightly more intense, and then you're moving it back off. It's very subtle, but you can use that to add some interest into this part of the song. In phrase 6, you're coming off of that really simple, straightforward feel of phrase 5, and it really adds this nice complement to phrase 5, and it's a transition point in the song. You've kind of created a little bit of tension, and phrase 6 still holds that tension a little bit. And then as you move into phrase 7 and 8, then we release that tension. So you can hear in phrase 5, it kind of, even though you're playing that same, just one note over and over again, it kind of builds up some tension there. It builds up a feeling of there's something happening. And phrase 6 kind of like moves into that more even. And then as you move into phrase 7 and 8, it helps that tension kind of comes to an end at the end of the song. Now, the main thing about this phrase is this transition going from this note to this note and then to this note. And it's a cross fingering. But we've seen this cross fingering before. You saw it in phrases 1 and 3, the same cross fingering pattern. So you've worked with this before, so the dexterity of this transition should be getting a little easier to move through. This is phrase 7, and in this phrase, the other note that may be new for some of you in this song is introduced here. It's the third note here with all the holes open. And so when you play this note, you'll need to support the flute in some way. And so it's a combination of different fingers supporting the flute as well as the mouth. And so here's what that looks like. So when playing the note with all the holes open, in the tutorial I'm showing my fingering is very accentuated to try and show how I do the fingering. But in my everyday playing, when I'm just playing and my hands are more relaxed, then often my pinkies are already on the flute and my thumbs as well are on the back. So both my thumbs, as everybody's usually are, and both the pinkies. And this way I can hold the flute. And this combination, along with my mouth, gives a lot of stability. Now you'll see a lot of times when I'm playing, I'll also have this pinky up, and you can also do it between the 3, but that requires the mouth, which is always there, so that's good, to keep the flute stable. So give that a try. And besides that transition, which isn't the most dexterily challenging transition back and forth, it's just teaching yourself how to hold the flute can be a little awkward at times in the beginning. But other than that, the phrase is pretty straightforward. And here we are at the last phrase, phrase 8, and this is really the culmination of the little bit of tension that was built up in phrases 5, 6, and 7. And so as you're coming off of phrase 7, you're doing a cross fingering that you've done before, going from this note to this note, and then you're moving through this sequence of notes, going to that same cross fingering again from this note to the final note. Now this verse and chorus combination, the verse being phrases 1 through 4 and the chorus being phrases 5 through 8, is usually repeated, or at least in the Elvis song that I know, it's repeated 3 times. And so each time you repeat it, you can kind of add your own flair into it. And as you get to know this song after playing it a number of times, you can really create your own style. And there's something nice about a straightforward song, is that it allows for a lot of improvisation and a lot of little additions here and there. So as you play it over and over again, and you really become familiar with it, and the and essentially memorize it, then note how you'll start feeling like you can start adding little bits in here, or holding one note a little longer than another note, or where it should be held, than where the music says it should be held. And so that's one of the beauties of music, is being able to throw your own style into it. And I always think of it as you're learning the rules. As you're learning this song, you're learning the rules of the song, the structure as it's written, so that you can break it in a really interesting way. Changing up the rhythm a little bit there on the second time through, to show how you can start changing up the verse and the chorus with each time you move through them.